I'd now like to introduce this morning's speaker, and this is a true honor to have this gentleman as our speaker. As you can see from the biographical data at your tables, Chief Reuben Greenberg has already at a very young age enjoyed a very distinguished career. But I'd like to mention just one additional thing, and that is in the preface to his book, and I have a copy of the book. It's out of print now. It was so popular it ran through 4 runs and is now out of print, and the publisher is trying to get Chief Greenberg to write a new book. But in the preface to his book, Chief Greenberg quotes Edmund Burke, and I quote, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing." I think his life and his career has exemplified his belief in that credo, and that he's taken on the responsibility himself to do something about it. Charleston is sometimes called Saintsville because of Chief Greenberg's efforts to lead a community-wide effort to take back the streets, and that's the name of his book. So let's take back the streets. So even though there is still some crime in Charleston, the chief assures me, when the forces of evil visit Charleston, they better pack a lunch, because he's got the resolve and got the interest and got the community support to do something about what seems to be insurmountable problems in criminal justice elsewhere. So without further ado, I'd like, and it's a very distinct honor, to introduce to you Chief Reuben Greenberg.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here with you this morning. It's really not all that early for me. I'm usually up and about by this time. I want to make sure that I talk about something that you're interested in, so I'm going to leave a little bit longer period for questions than I normally would. But I strongly suspect that the reason why that you invited me to meet with you this morning and participate in what I hope will get to be a discussion is because that I've been associated with a degree of success in Charleston that many cities have not had. Charleston, the city of about 100,000 people, we have a diverse population, I guess you would say. We have people come from all over the world as visitors, about 5.5 million a year. We have 41% minorities. 40% of that is black minorities, and 1% other types of minorities. And then the rest, of course, would be the majority population. We've had some degree of success with respect to homicide. For a long time, I believed that there wasn't much you could do about homicide, except after somebody killed somebody, you went and perhaps would draw chalk around the body, take a few photographs, and try to find out who it was that killed the person. We never thought that we could actually prevent homicides except in very limited circumstances. Somebody's on a tower shooting down into a crowd of school children. If you get a SWAT team in place fast enough, they've already killed 2 or 3, undoubtedly will kill additional people unless you stop them. And preventing homicide in that sense could be accomplished. But we didn't believe that anything could be done about the biggest problem of homicide in most communities, and that is domestic violence. We felt it was just something that happened. It was very bad in the world, and we simply came in and picked up the pieces in much the same way that a fire department puts out a fire after it started. But we never really tried to do much about domestic violence until about 12 years ago in Charleston. And at that time, we decided to look upon it in quite a different way. And it's changed domestic violence to where it's, many communities, it's over half of all homicides. In our community, it's only about 15%. And that number is, some years we have nobody killed in a domestic violence situation. You know, and unheard of even in small cities where they might have 2 or 3 homicides a year. 1 or 2 of them will be with respect to domestic violence of one kind or the other. I could spend a lot of time talking about how we went about that particular process, but I'll simply say this about it. we decided to look upon domestic violence victims in the same way that we would a victim who was a person who was victimized by a stranger. A man assaults a woman, beats her about the head and shoulders with his fists as she walks down the street in some town. She goes to the police, to the telephone, dials 911. The police come out, and she says, "There goes the man right there." We would think it would be irresponsible for the police to say, "I'll tell you what, you go and spend the night with your mother tonight, and we'll have him take a cooling-off walk around the block." But that's precisely what we did with respect to domestic violence in Charleston and throughout the country for many years. Just because people had the same address, just because they had the same last name, we treated it as if somehow it was a different type of crime. We started handling it in the same way we would any other type of crime, and we found that rather than being the most difficult crime to prevent, domestic violence turned out to be the easiest homicides, at least, to prevent. And the reason is because we got so many chances. Poor convenience store clerk working the late night shift, guy comes in, holds up the store, kills her, or worse yet, captures her, takes her off into the woods someplace, assaults her and kills her there. There's really not a great deal the police can do to prevent that kind of thing. But in domestic violence, the police generally go back and forth, and every one of those repetitious times is an opportunity to have an impact to prevent what ultimately could lead to a homicide of one party or the other, in some cases both parties. So when we changed that fundamental philosophy, then we started seeing those numbers drop. We also did some other things, and we wanted to do things that didn't cost a lot of money because we don't have a lot of money. We have to try to make do within existing resources. And we found in the police department that once you had a degree of success using your existing resources, it was amazing how easy it was to get additional resources. In other words, if once you're successful, people will say, "Hey, look what these guys are doing with this equipment and these personnel and these resources that they have." And once they see that level of success and they feel they're getting something for it, you don't have to beg them for additional resources. Resources will be really forthcoming, certainly by any enlightened political group that was in control of a town or city. One of the things we decided to do is we looked at the criminal justice system and said that we already know, which everybody does probably by now, thanks to all kind of TV programs on the topic, that is that 80% of the crimes are committed by only 20% of the criminals. We said, boy, that's great. I'm sure glad that those numbers are as they are, because that means if we can isolate that 20%, then we can reduce this big number of the 80% of the crimes. And it turns out that rather than, as one person asked me a couple of years ago, a mayor of a city, he said, "What I'd like you to do is to come here and eliminate crime." And I said, "Well, I don't know. We don't think we're going to be able to do that. That's too big a goal." What we learned that we have to do is we have to have limited goals. And you have to have limited goals for psychological reasons and also for practical reasons. A limited goal has a greater probability of success. And people that work on a different problem want success. And if you give them a goal that's achievable, it's not easy, but it's achievable, and you accomplish that goal, then bite off another piece of that goal and go further, then you can encourage people by the additional successes that you have each step of the way, as opposed to taking a look at the whole thing and saying, let's everybody ask questions at once, as opposed to picking various individuals and making some sort of progress in that fashion. So what we decided to do was take a look at 3 particular crimes that we felt were very, very important with respect to safety. And these 3 crimes are one property crime, which was burglary. People don't like to have their homes broken into. They feel much more violated than if somebody breaks into his or her business, for example. Businessman has business broken into downtown someplace. He doesn't like that. But when he comes and finds that his house, the place that's his inner sanctum, where his safety is at stake, where he sleeps, where all of his personal and private possessions are, when that's violated, that's a different situation. So we felt that that was one of the crimes we were going to work on. And fortunately there, we were easy to work on that problem as well, because one burglar might be responsible for 40, 50, even 100 burglaries. So you're not talking about a great number of people, though you may be talking about a great number of crimes. The other crime we decided to work on was sexual assault. With respect to other crimes, there aren't many sexual assaults, certainly not with respect to burglaries or larcenies or even auto thefts in any city. But it's a very, very terrible crime, whether the victim is a male or female or a small child or an older person. It's a very, very terrible crime, and it sends all kinds of waves through the community that this is not a safe place, this is not a place we want to be, this is not a place where it's safe for commerce to take place. So we decided to zero in on that crime as well, and we found that while most of the perpetrators were single individual type cases, there were many nonetheless that were serial rapists. So here again, you weren't talking about a great number of people. Finally, the third one was armed robbery. People don't, again, like to get robbed at gunpoint or knife point, especially on the street. That if we could have an impact on those three crimes, then we could make a real impact in the community. Your car gets broken into, well, we can live with that if we have to. Your car gets stolen. We can live with that if we have to as well. Bad checks, credit card fraud, all of these kinds of things. Forgeries, these are crimes, of course, very serious to the individual victims, but not particularly injurious to the quality of life of the people in the community as these other three crimes were. So we decided to address these crimes with the criminals that were the easiest to find. And the criminals that were the easiest to find were, of course, those who were already in jail. It turns out that 86% of burglars, when they are released from prison, are going to come back out on the street, and burglarize again within 3 years. So, and with such a high number of burglars coming back out, we said, well, if you wanted to put your hand on 500 burglars right now, where would you go? I mean, you had to put your hand on them in the next 10 hours. Where would you go to find these people? Well, of course, you'd go to jail or prison, and that's where they would be. And so we decided that we're going to oppose the parole of every burglar, every armed robber, and every rapist that was arrested by the Charleston Police Department, individual convicted and sent away to state prison. We weren't going to sit in the squad room any longer and complain and moan about the, we've got women here, complain and moan about the revolving door of the criminal justice system. You arrest an individual, he gets 20 years or 15 years or 10 years, and in a few months or a few years you see him back out on the street. We said to ourselves, we sit around and we complain about this, but have we ever gone to the parole board to try to stop any of these guys from getting parole? And nobody would ever go, oh, they wouldn't listen to us. Well, how do you know? Well, they just won't listen. But let's go up and see. Let's drive the 2.5 hours from Charleston to Columbia and confront the parole board when these guys come up for parole. The next burglar, the next armed robber, the next rapist. Let's see what happens. At that time, 75% actually 76% of the people coming up for parole were paroled. 24% were denied parole. We felt if we could get that to be a 50-50 mix, it would be tremendous. We started that program 9 years ago, and in the past 9 years, we have been 93% successful in preventing people from getting parole. It's possible for a prisoner from Charleston, South Carolina, when we go up to oppose his parole, he's got a 10-year sentence. It's possible to keep him in jail 7.5 years. Unheard of. I mean, he's entitled to the other time off because of good behavior. But we found we were not going to achieve that by hoping that the parole board would do a good job, because they're supposed to. We had to go up there and not just send letters, but look them in the baby blues or browns or whatever the case might be, and say, we don't want that person to come back to our community. We couldn't do that for every person that we arrested, but we could do it for every burglar, every armed robber, and every rapist. And there were other reasons for doing it for everyone as well. You stay away from a lot of people who like to use the racial card in everything that comes up. If you get them all, every one of them, no exceptions, we oppose a parole of every one of them. And so that's what we did. If they came up for parole, we said no. We took the victim of the burglary, the armed robbery, the rape with us whenever possible, and gave them a nice breakfast, very similar to the one we had here this morning, and looked at them and let them look at the parole board and say, we don't want that person to come back to our community. Because that person we found was all dressed up, had removed 3 or 4 earrings they had in the ear, nose ring was gone, a nice suit, cut their hair, had the local minister with them, their grandmother, some former high school coach, had all these people with them, but nobody was there representing the interests of the victim, who in many cases still lived in the same neighborhood where this person was going to go. So we said, we're going to represent the interest of the victim. We're going to talk about this sexual assault where this person not only used his own body, but also a stick, and mention all of these things. Bring it back to the parole board, because nobody's going to talk about these things unless we go up there and show up. And we decided to do that, and we have had excellent success. If there are people that we ought to be able to incarcerate, and they ought to be burglars, they ought to be armed robbers, and they ought to be rapists. We don't do it with respect to homicide every time. Occasionally we do, because most homicides are a one-in-a-shot type situation and not likely, statistically otherwise, to kill anybody else. But every burglar, every armed robber, and every rapist, and when you do that, guess what's going to happen? The incidents of rape, incidents of armed robbery, and burglary are going to go down. We had 2,000 fewer burglaries in the city of Charleston from 1982 to 1992 than we had from 1962 to 1972, 2,000 fewer. And the reason is because you're dealing with a few individuals who are committing a lot of crimes. And burglary certainly is indicative of this, and certainly armed robbery is, and to a lesser extent sexual assault, but of course it's a very, very serious crime. How much did it cost us to do this? How many new people did we hire? None. We use one officer who goes to the parole board whenever we have somebody up for parole. Doesn't even go every week. They meet every Wednesday, but he doesn't go every week because we don't have somebody every week. But whenever we do, he goes to the parole board and he said, we don't want that person to be paroled, and here's the reasons why. And that's been very, very, very successful. Very frankly, if I thought that the burglars would get out of prison and move away, perhaps to Atlanta, I wouldn't care whether they got out of jail or not. I really wouldn't. But they're not going to go to Atlanta. They're going to come right back to Charleston, where they were born and raised and have all their contacts and relatives. And it's because I know that. It is because I know that, the reason why I oppose that parole. There's another reason as well. In our society, the older a person is when he is released from prison, then the less likely he is to recidivate and go back, become a recidivist and go back to a prison. As a matter of fact, after the age of 35, the number of people who enter prison, regardless of how many times they've been arrested, after age 35 goes down to almost nothing. I'm on a chart, like 2-3% of the population who committed crimes after age 35. Indeed, there's only one group of people in our country that increases its participation in the criminal justice system after age 35. And of course, that's lawyers. That's when they start going to jail. But as the lawyers are starting, for everybody else, they've given up. They've learned that, hey, this doesn't pay. And so the age factor is very, very important in delaying them from getting out on parole. Remember, these people are people who are already guilty. The question is whether they're going to get out early or not get out early. Now, this argument breaks completely down, I must admit, if you believe in rehabilitation, that people can change and they will never do it anymore simply because they say so or because their social worker says so. I don't believe that. So I'm operating on the premise that some of them will change, but whether they do or not, in the meantime, let's punish them. And for those, so that argument does break down if you put a great value on rehabilitation. Unfortunately, experience has shown me I do not. I once believed in rehabilitation very strongly, I used to teach sociology. I taught for 5 years, California State University at Hayward, and actually taught sociology all that time before I learned better. And it turned out that very nice in theory, but in practice it just didn't seem to work that way, that nothing seemed to work. It appears that we don't have the skills necessary to fundamentally change people's basic desires about how they want to relate to the rest of us, that those kinds of things have to be formed within that individual at a much sooner period than any sociologist has an opportunity in order to work with that individual, any social worker. Another thing we decided to do that really made a difference in our community, particularly with respect to juveniles, is again something that was cheap, inexpensive, because we don't have a lot of resources, and something that was already tried. It didn't require using a lot of political capital to get new laws passed and all that. And that was something, we went back to something that we hadn't had in a long time in Charleston. We went back to something that was about 50 years old, and that was the truancy program. We decided that we were going to start picking up every kid, again, every, so that nobody can say, well, they do some kids and they don't do the other kids, and this side of town and that side of town. Every kid that we could find, whether they were doing anything or not, didn't matter, but if they appeared to be between the ages of 6 years old and 17 years old, which is the legal age for quitting school in South Carolina, we're going to pick these kids up and take them back to school. And people, well, you can't do that. I say, you know, yeah, that might work in Charleston, but would it work in a city this size? Let me tell you something. They had truant officers in New York City, a city of 8 million people, as well as truant officers in Buffalo Breath, Montana. They worked in cities of that size and cities of this size. In New York City, of course, they had hundreds of them, and they were designed to force kids to go to school. That's what it was for. They went around, not with guns, and they weren't police officers as they are in Charleston. They went around in their own cars, and I have some experience with them, I know. And they went around in their own cars, and they picked kids up, and they took them back to school. They didn't take them to jail. They didn't take them to any kind of penal institution. They took them back to the school that they particularly went to. And we started this in Charleston. That's what happened. Well, yes, but just picking them up says, yeah, you know, it's not something new. We've got plenty of case law on it, you know, like about 60 years worth. Well, why did we stop doing it? Let me tell you why we stopped picking kids up. But before I do that, I'll tell you what the results were. The results were, since we started picking kids up, that was been 3.5 years ago now, not a single kid has been shot or stabbed or beaten up or anything else out on the street during school hours, because they're simply not there. We've taken them from a place, and our objective was not an educational objective. I first of all want to admit that. We were trying to stop auto thefts. That's what we were after. Kids were eating us alive with auto thefts. And we said, how can we isolate this group? Well, we could isolate them because we didn't have to see them doing anything except, you know, you look at your watch and it's 10 o'clock, you look at him, he says he's 11, you know, he ought to go back to school. And we took him back to school, and it worked very, very well, as you might expect. Now, how did we get away from this? Well, in the late 1960s, people gained control over our educational system that believed that we don't need something as punitive as a truant officer to make kids go to school. That's very punitive and old-fashioned. We're going to develop a curriculum that's so wonderful, that's so exciting, that's so dynamic, that's so interesting, that kids will want to come to school. They'll think that reading and writing and arithmetic is fun. They'll be wanting to go to school so much that in the morning when the janitor comes to turn on the heat and the lights on the school building, he'll have to step over them as he walks up the sidewalk. In the afternoon, the school bus drivers would be honking on the horns, trying to get them to leave the library and get on the bus so they can go home. I said, fine. The problem is nobody ever asked the kids, would you rather go to school or would you rather go to the mall? Would you rather go to school or would you rather go to the beach? Nobody ever asked that question. So we went back to picking the kids up. Our daytime crime rate went down 27% by putting 4 police officers, one in each precinct of the city, whose job it was to pick kids up and take them back to school. all of the police officers bird dog force. In other words, they couldn't have time to do this because they were answering calls one right after the other. But they'd see a kid on the street corner, say there are two juveniles about 14 years old, white t-shirt, blue jeans, whatever they were wearing on the corner of Smith and Jackson Street. They need to have a truant officer check them out. And he'd continue on his call. The truant officer would go to that particular location, pick these kids up, take them back to their schools. And we've got the name of every kid that was stopped, and we've picked something like 3,500 of them up now. Probably close to about 3,000. Some of them are multiples, but 3,500 different times. We got their ages, the schools they went to, and you know who was that? There's a wonderful program. Parents loved it because it got their kids into the school where they should have been. We loved it because it put them right back into a place where everybody knew them, as opposed to putting them out on the street where they had anonymity, and anonymity makes it possible to commit a lot of crimes that where people know you, it's much more difficult to do so. And some of the school administrators didn't like it. They didn't say, we don't like it. But you ever read body language? When you were walking up that long sidewalk to the school, and the principal or the guidance counselor looks and, oh, that Smith kid again, bringing them back to that school. But that's the idea that it was. A lot of these guys, they wrote dissertations. One of the principal's doctorate was on school discipline problems. I remember when he first wanted to be principal, he went around and shook hands and lobbied all the school board members and everything else, did everything he could to get that job. Well, he got it. He's got to take the bad along with the good. He can't, if they don't want them to go to be in the school, they got to expel them. Because in our city, there's 2 locations for a kid between 5 years of age and 17. One is in school, and the other one is at home. If he's expelled or suspended, I can't take him to the school. He goes home. But it's not a choice, as some school board member says, well, I'd rather have him in school than have him out on the street forming gangs. Forming out on the street forming gang is not the other alternative. They need to go to one of 2 locations, the custody of their parents, which we interpret it to be home, or the custody of the school, which of course is the school building. But this other places, the mall and riding around in their cars and all of that. And by the way, those that have got cars, they're easy to control because all you got to do is see them driving a car. You stop the car and you give them a ride back to their school because you're afraid something might happen to them, so you tow their car. Somebody has got to pay the bill for the tow. And we haven't found any parents willing to pay the $60 towing bill, but maybe once or twice before they find something else to do with the car keys to that particular car. So very, very easy for those guys. There's nothing bad. There's no courts are involved in it. It simply says, if you're going to be in this city, you got to be in school if you're at this age, or you got to be at home. You can't be walking up and down the street, breaking automobiles, snatching purses, and breaking into people's houses. And that's the reason why our crime rate, daytime crime rate, went down 27% when we started this program. And we can now in the summertime, that's different. Summertime, they eat us alive, Chief. They eat us alive. But I'm not a person that has to have everything. I've got 9 months, they've got 3, so give me something. But we don't have that kind of leverage in the summertime. We started another program called Operation Midnight because of the success of the truancy program. It was so successful. Let's see if we can get kids off the street after midnight. So we started a program, not a curfew, but in cooperation with their parents. We advertise it on TV and radio and everything. If you got a kid who's been hanging out late at night, all you got to do is register that kid with the Charleston Police Department. We'll put him in our computer. You sign this document saying we got the right to stop him, whether he or she is doing anything or not. Pick him up, and we take him home. It's not a curfew. No judges are involved, no courts, no expensive follow-up and overtime and all of that, because it's a waste of time to do that. And it's a waste of time because they steal cars. What happens? Nothing. If nothing happens when they steal cars and break into people's houses, why in the world do we think that somehow presenting them to the court because they were out late at night violating a curfew is going to make a difference? I mean, that just doesn't stand up under examination. So we decided after 12 o'clock, a kid between a toddler, and a person who's 17 years old ought to be at home. It turns out that we felt that there was no constitutional right. We could find no case law establishing that a 4-year-old kid had the right to walk down the street. And police officers drive by and say, hey, well, he's not doing anything, so can't arrest him, and continuing on. And that's essentially what had been happening. Anybody who does that, I would think a police officer would be irresponsible. Well, guess what we found out? We found out that there's only one right that a 17-year-old has that a four-year-old does not have. And you can probably guess what it is. Only one right. They have the same constitutional rights. Neither can vote, neither can hold public office, neither can sign contracts in his own name. There's only one right, and that's the right to drive. That's the only right a 17-year-old has. There is no constitutional right, according to us and our state attorney general, for a 4-year-old or 17-year-old to be out on the street after 12 o'clock at night against his parents' wishes. And even for the 4-year-old, even if his parents say it's okay, that would be considered to be negligence and child abuse, and the kid could be picked up and the parents brought up on charges. So we decided to start picking up again every kid that we could after 12 o'clock at night. And we've got the names of every kid. So if somebody says, well, you get more blacks and you get more whites, you get more girls and boys, you get from this side of town and that side of town. We've avoided all of that because we got the names of every one of them, and it shows that we got every one that we could, every one that we can find. And we have officers out who call Operation Midnight officers. And what they're doing is looking for kids, not who are stealing or breaking into automobiles, but who are out on the street, who are 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 years old, who are out on the street without parental supervision, the parents not with them, and we pick them up and take them back home. We've taken some kids as far away as 50 miles away. And the cop said to me, the chief's turning us into taxi drivers. I said, yeah, but we're the most wonderful taxi drivers there are, because look how low the crime rate is going, and we're transporting these juveniles before they break into houses, before they get stabbed or shot, before they break into automobiles, before they steal automobiles. But before, we only transported them after all of these things happened. Then we transported them and took them to this location or whatever. And let's try it on that basis. How much did that cost? Nothing. We use existing officers, and what happened? The number of cases dropped, and now our cases handled by our detectives has gone down lower than it's ever been, certainly during the time, almost 13 years I've been in Charleston. So the less work, hundreds of times that detectives were not assigned cases, hundreds of times that thousands of times that a police officer didn't go out to handle a call because it didn't occur. Nobody went out to dust around fingerprint powder and take photographs of scene because the scenes didn't occur. So it made us use our personnel in other more serious cases much more effectively. These three really simple ways of dealing with that, along with the domestic violence issue, by putting a cost on it, arresting people every time. A lot of the police departments do that, but also providing services, helping people to get away from abusive mates. Not only saying you are, but affirmatively doing that. We have driven people to Myrtle Beach from Charleston. We've driven people to Savannah from Charleston, to Columbia from Charleston, people with their children who otherwise would be beaten again as soon as the guy came from wherever he was hiding or had gone around, or perhaps killed. Some chiefs ask, well, how do you have the personnel to do this? Easy to find the personnel, because if we don't do it, in cases where we didn't do it in the early years, came back to a house 45 minutes later after having been there, and now the same woman we was talking to was laying on the living room floor with a knife in her back. And guess what? The two original officers returned, the sergeant on the watch returns, the lieutenant on the watch returns, the coroner shows up, the medical examiner shows up, EMS shows up to make sure that there's no life left in the person whatsoever, and a crime scene officer comes up, making a chalk mark around the body, taking photographs. 11 different people show up if she's killed, and not one of them will do her any good whatsoever. Not one of them. So we're going to take one of the guys that we're going to bring here if he's killed. Well, one of the 11 guys, well, we're going to bring the other 10. We're just going to take one of them and take her to a grandmother's house or to a friend's house or a relative's house or someplace where that person can be safe from this bully. We started doing that, and it started making a big difference, and we did it with respect to rich and poor. Finally, if you go to Charleston and you go to various areas, and I'm sure there are many, many safe areas here in Atlanta, But one of the things you'll find in a lot of cities is graffiti. You can have the safest place there is, but if you have all kind of gang graffiti and all kind of marks on the walls and spray can paint, it's hard to convince people that it's a safe place, even though in fact it is. They simply don't feel comfortable going to that kind of place. And so we decided that we were going to use existing resources again to solve this problem. We took prisoners from the jail, I mean, you know, already being fed, clothed, housed, medical care, everything else. And we took SL&L cops, we call them SL&L, sick, lame, lazy, you know, the ones that hurt their leg, and hurt the arm, and this and that and everything else. And people that we would have to pay anyway to be on light duty someplace and piddling around with shuffling papers somewhere in the department, took them and got prisoners from the jail, people with, you know, traffic violations or child support or whatever, fraud violations, bad checks, credit card fraud, people that if one of them escaped, nobody would feel threatened in his bed at night. Took those individuals, put them to work, picking up paper and trash and eradicating graffiti. If you come to Charleston today, you will find no graffiti. The graffiti isn't there because our criminals are so nice and wonderful they don't put graffiti up. It's because we make an effort to eradicate graffiti, and we presented it as a service of the city. We don't ask individual people about it. We present it as a service of the city. We pick up garbage from private property. We fight fires on private property. We provide police service on private property, and people pay a tax for that. We eradicate graffiti from walls of businesses and fences and sidewalks because as a service, as a taxpayer service, to try to get with this individual owner and that owner and urge them to get rid of it as soon as possible. Our graffiti, if it's seen by 10 o'clock, it's gone by 5 o'clock because we're on top of that particular problem. Some days we don't fight graffiti at all because there isn't any. But as soon as some shows up, we immediately go out. In the meantime, these guys do all kinds of other things, using these existing resources to do something beneficial to the community. Sending them to the auditorium, cleaning all the gum from up under the seats and the arm handles. We do that when it's raining, and it always seems to be gum, so that's something that won't run out of. Cleaning the floors, washing police cars, waxing floors in public buildings, picking up paper and trash in ditches, emptying garbage cans in various types of parks and so forth, putting these individuals to work, using these individuals, and most of them, they want to work. They don't want to sit up there and watch television or whatever. There's probably a lot more of them that want to come out than we would want to take a chance on or would have the number of SL&L officers in order to manage. Things like this can really make a difference. Now, I've talked about some things here already, but I haven't talked about arrests at all. I've talked about preventing crime through enforcing the truancy laws like we used to do. Preventing crime by helping parents keep their kids off the street after midnight like parents and community used to do. When I was a kid, no police officer would pass me at 14 years old at 2 o'clock in the morning without stopping and asking, what are you doing on the street this time of night? Where do you live? I am taking you home. But now we do that. We expected somehow it would just go away, that crime would just disappear somehow. You know, we sit there in our patrol cars and light changes and two teenagers, 11 o'clock in the morning, walk in front of us. We look at them, I wonder why they're not in school. We never did anything about it. We never once stopped them and asked them, why aren't you in school? Get in the car, you're going back to your school. And we started doing that, and it started making a difference. We also did some things in reference to drugs, where we looked upon drugs as a business rather than simply as a crime. You know, we're arresting people back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. The town of Mount Pleasant arrested one of our local drug dealers after we'd arrested him as well. The sheriff's office had arrested him, arrested a guy, took him to the county jail, handcuffed behind him. As he got out of the car, for whatever reason, he bumped the police officer, knocking him to the side, and took off running, handcuffed, down the street. This guy had been arrested, about 19 years old, been arrested numerous times. As he ran down the street, he ran into the path, across the street, of an 18-wheeler, and he got hit and killed. And they tell me it was particularly horrible because his body was flipping back through the wheels and so forth of the thing. When they heard about that in the detective division, I can't say that anybody cried about it, but they said, well, perhaps a A higher power has taken interest in his case, and we won't be troubled with him any longer selling drugs. And of course that was right. This guy had received a kind of a death penalty, but it did us some good for only one day. The very next day, on the same street corner where he sold drugs, there was another guy there selling drugs just as wild as ever. And we realized, wait a minute, this guy just got the death penalty in effect, but this street corner, people are still selling drugs there. And the reason why they were selling there was because it was a profitable place to sell drugs. As long as it's a profitable place to sell drugs, somebody is going to fill that particular market. So we decided what we needed to do was to destroy, forget about the arrest, was to destroy that location as a place that you could make money for selling drugs. I was listening to TV this morning, they were talking about Eastern Airlines paying off some of their creditors. You know, the reason why Eastern Airlines went out of business wasn't because they weren't, the planes weren't taking off, were taking off empty. They had people in every one of those airplanes, but they didn't have enough to make it worthwhile to continue. And that was the solution to our place. We had 31 different local heavy drug markets. I mean, heavy drug markets, 10 or 15 different vendors at each different drug market. But we went into those places and we eradicated all of those heavy drug markets where you had that kind of traffic. Drugs are still sold in Charleston as they are in most other cities, but they're not sold on the street nearly as much as they used to, which means you don't have the street violence accompanying it. You don't have the drive-by shootings. You don't have the daily and weekly occurrences of shootouts on the street between suspects, between the one group of suspects and another group of suspects selling drugs. So we had an impact on that type of thing. We controlled the streets. It became our turf rather than their turf, and the people stopped trying to buy, people stopped selling drugs there because they couldn't make enough money to make it worthwhile. Every one of them sold drugs, but they weren't selling enough. All you got to do is cut down the volume. You don't have to cut it down to zero. We found you cut the volume by 30% with their costs and risk and everything else is no longer worth engaging in the activity. And that's what was, and we did that by putting a uniformed police officer, as we have in one location today, and we'll probably be there for the next 3 weeks, standing right on the street corner with the drug dealer. We don't say anything to the drug dealer because the ACLU doesn't want us to say anything to the drug dealer. We don't pat him down because we don't have any probable cause to pat him down. I mean, what are we going to say to him? He's been arrested numerous times, and he's waiting trial right now. And sooner or later, he'll get some time. But the point is, we're there to keep the customers away. When he meanders down the street, the police officer meanders 40 feet behind him. That's the agreed-upon distance. You know, with the libertarians, is go 40 feet behind. They go 40 feet behind him. Be surprised. People won't even stop to say hello to this guy. They can't make that connection. Somebody said, all they'll do is move across town. You know, this is a business. They can't move across town. Every time a retail business moves, it's going to lose some customers that it would have kept had they stayed at the former location. That's true of these businesses as well. But these businesses, unfortunately, can't advertise their locations. They can't send their customers a postcard saying, I'm moving my drug-selling business to the corner or whatever it is. So we take advantage of those things. About 30% of the drug dealers went out of business. About 30% went out of business. 70% stayed in business. But 30% went out of business without arrest, without putting anybody in jail through the expensive criminal justice system and so forth. We'd never come across anything would you handle 30% of the problem so easily. Some of the places caved in as little as 3 weeks. Other places took 9 weeks with a police officer there. And it was easy to find cops too. I wouldn't go out there, without a partner or something. But we got a lot of young cops. And if you're under 25, you can't be killed. So you don't worry about going out there on the street with these guys. So they stand out there and in their uniforms, no undercover, and we have checkpoints stopping all the cars in the area when they come through these drug areas. In other words, raising the cost, raising the risk, identifying people, accountants, other police officers, lots of lawyers, nurses, and various other people who are there to buy drugs. Coming in, you seize the person's BMW. You got to go home and tell the old lady something. Where's the car? Because we're going to have that for a while and maybe forever. So all of these things No one of these things by himself was the key or the magic pill. Do all of these different things, zero in on the problem, not all criminals, but those three, those are the ones we oppose for parole. Those are the ones between 5 and 6 years old and 17, reference to truancy. And anybody from toddlers or 17 late at night on the street, pick these people up, take them back to the custody of their parents, to their homes, or to the school, whichever was appropriate. We do all of these things, fight the drug dealers with their rights. They have certain rights, we have certain rights. Panhandlers, it's not a big problem in our city because we hand out leaflets. Because somebody said the panhandler has a First Amendment right to walk up to people and beg for money. So that's their First Amendment rights. When I was growing up, we didn't have these rights. Because if we had those rights, that's what I would have done for a living probably. But we didn't have these kinds of rights, but somebody's decided, some judge somewhere decided, they got the First Amendment right to ask people for money on the street. And you can't interfere with that. So what we do is we have our foot patrol officers in the downtown area, and when the guy comes up and asks somebody for money and the people keep walking, we don't do anything. And if they say to him, to heck with you, we don't do anything. But if the person reaches for his wallet, or if he opens up person opens up her purse, starts to look like they're going to give him money, we give them a leaflet because government has constitutional rights as well. And one of those rights is to pass out leaflets. And these leaflets say, and I have one of them here, it says, what'll it be, spare change or real change? Shows a picture of a hobo on the front of it, and inside it says, too often your spare change feeds only drug and alcohol addiction. So please stop giving to panhandlers and stop feeling guilty about it. It says the next time you ask for spare change on the street, tell that person that the citizens of this community provide food, clothing, and shelter for every homeless person. In other words, letting people know, visitors or whatever, that you don't have, you're actually hurting the situation. You want to give your money to something, give it to a charity of your choice that helps the homeless. One of the officers said something to me, and I'm sure it's true. He said, Chief, the easiest job in the world is to convince people not to give money. He said, you always have takers, not to give money. He said, you'd be surprised how easy it is. So we don't say anything to the criminal. We don't arrest him. We wait until he gets a hit and the person goes in his pocket and his eyes light up. Uniform officer stands over, ma'am, you might want to read this before. Never has one of them decided to give him any money. This really hurts them. Now, this is an idea we learned from the City of Philadelphia Chamber of Commerce, by the way. Very inexpensive, costs about $1.50 a piece, but very, very effective, because what it does is it takes their paying customers away from them, just like that. And all you got to do is, you don't have to say anything to them, violate their rights, or even acknowledge that they're there. Just hand it. Various kinds of things can be done to reduce not just crime, but victimization and intimidation. Let me take a pause here. Give me that glass of water. I'd appreciate it. And perhaps answer a question or so that somebody might have. Or maybe you might want to make a statement. Yes, sir. Look. Yes, sir.
I was wondering if you'd be interested in moving to Atlanta.
This is a very, very fine city, but I think I'm going to stay in Charleston for a few more months. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Chief Greenberg, comment on your improvement of the crime situation in the public housing project.
Yeah, well, I'll talk to you about it. I don't like to talk about it a lot because it's a non-problem to us. Public housing crime is a non-problem to us and hasn't been for 6 or 7, almost 8 years. Public housing is one of the safest places to sleep in the city of Charleston. We go years without anybody being killed there. In a bad year, we have about 8,000 people in public housing in our city. In a bad year, we might have 2 armed robberies in a bad year in the public housing complexes. Might have 3 or 4 rapes. I don't think we've ever had more than 4 rapes in a single year out of the 2,500 units that we have. Burglary would be maybe 26 burglaries, I think, last year out of more than 1,000 in the city, so it's obviously not that. It's about 2.4% of the serious crimes occur in public housing, and 1.8% of the non-serious crimes. We get a lot of calls in public housing, you know, calls for service, but so far as people being shot, killed, raped, house broken into, I think last year we arrested 18 people for narcotics violations. Out of almost 1,000 people we arrested, only 18 came from public housing. We started that because we decided to become responsible landlords like any other landlord. You can't live in public housing if you make $100,000 a year because you make too much money. We also came up with a similar concept that you can't live in public housing if you're too much of a criminal. In other words, if you have convictions of 11 different crimes within the last 10 years, and I want to stress convictions, not arrests, of sexual assault, pedophilia, these types of things, you can't come into. Drug dealing, you can't come into public housing until you've shown that you've gone a long period of time, you know, like 10 years, without engaging in these crimes. So we started becoming like, you know, any other landlord, being responsible. We wouldn't rent a first come, first served. Said first come, first looked at, but you may never be served because you're too much of a continuing criminal. You couldn't expect this hotel to be a safe place if you allowed convicted rapists, armed robbers, and murderers and everything else to gather here. Well, you can't expect public housing to be that. And we're doing that not for our own sake, but on the behalf of the people who are already there. It's only 10% of the people that are bad anyway. So why should the 10% dominate the 90%? That's another easy job because you're dealing with only 10% of the population of the area. So if it's such a small group, unless number one hand, keep them out, keeping them from getting in to start with, and second, if they're already in, we grandfathered everybody in, no matter what they had done, as long as it didn't do anything new of these 11 different crimes. And we went in, and if they did, we filed suit against them. Not just criminal charges, but a civil suit, accusing them of violating the conditions of their lease. And we've never lost one of those cases because all you need is the preponderance of the evidence, 51%. For a conviction, you got to get beyond a reasonable doubt. But for a civil case, all you need is preponderance. You got to explain to the judge why cocaine was up on the second floor bedroom in the dresser drawer on the left-hand side. I've heard a lot of people try to explain that. None have succeeded. You know, and so they went out and we got somebody else in who doesn't sell cocaine or get involved in those type of things. So it's public housing is the absolute safest place consistently year after year in the city of Charleston for Part 1 crimes or Part 2 crimes. Because what they are people just like you and me, but they just don't have any money. We got the criminals out. We let them go somewhere else. And somebody said, well, where did they go? Liberals always ask that. Where did they go, you know? You know, no other landlord, when he gets rid of a bad tenant, says, where did he go, you know? Nobody, we don't know where they go. You know, they can go wherever they want to go. What we're saying is we as the taxpayers are not going to subsidize them any longer. We're not saying we're going to change their lifestyle and never going to do anything criminal again. Though we must admit people already in public housing stopped engaging in criminal activity. Not because they would be arrested, been arrested for years, but because they won't have a place to sleep if they don't. They're going to stop engaging in criminal activity. And that's the reason why, that was their incentive. Yes, sir. Sorry, it's a bit difficult for me to hear you. Yes, sir.
And my program, no teenage pregnancies,
Sure.
12 years, no child who didn't go to college in 12 years. We can't get help.
You're right.
Industry,
Well, you see, the mistake you're making is you're teaching values. You're holding the individual himself or herself responsible for what he does. It's not the government's fault or the mayor's fault or the governor's fault. It's not the fault of somebody else from somewhere else. But when you hold people accountable for their own misdeeds, and that's what, in fact, what we're doing in public housing. You're the one that robbed a bank. We don't want any bank robbers here. You raped a woman, and you're the one that's a convicted pedophile. The women here, you know, don't have husbands in public housing, most of them. You got a lot of little small kids. They don't feel comfortable with guys like you living next door with nothing but a piece of sheetrock separating your apartment from theirs. So you gotta live somewhere else. You know, you can't live here because your presence here will diminish the quality of life for these ladies. They don't want to go to work at Burger King or anywhere else, you know, and leave you there watching their kids next door play out in the front yard. They don't want to do that. And so therefore, you know, I know you need housing, but the house for you is over there someplace where somebody is going to make excuses for your behavior and is going to say that you paid your debt to society and all of that. These people don't want to hear that. They want a safe, clean environment, and we are mandated by law to provide that. But we can't provide that by letting convicted rapists, burglars, armed robbers, prostitutes, people gambling, people engaging in drug trafficking and other kinds of crimes. I think you got time for one last one. Yes, ma'am. That what? Yeah. Yeah. Well, I question whether or not there even ought to be such an institution as a juvenile court. I understand that there should be differential punishment for somebody that's 11 or 12 or 13 or 14 years old as opposed to somebody, you know, that's 50 years old. I can understand that, but I don't know if that needs to be a particular court, a separate court for that. You could make a case for a separate court for people over 60. I mean, if you wanted to, you know, I'm sure somebody could try to do that. But our juvenile court system is a shambles. And the reason is because it's a basic premise, not how it's organized, but the basic premise. That is that a kid can't commit a crime. That's the premise on which, and the court's job is not to punish, but to, according to our law, to help the child. Well, they say you can't help the child by putting him in jail. How is that going to help the child? But so therefore, the kids are not held accountable in any kind of meaningful way. One of the things we've done in the last legislature is we've changed the definition of a child with respect to specific crimes. For example, the new law says July 1st this year that a child is not a person 16 years of age who commits a crime with a gun. Okay, for other purposes, he is a child. He still can't sign contracts and things like that. But if they commit a crime with a gun, then they stop being a child. That person is arrested and sent through the juvenile system. You don't have to go to the judge and have the judge transfer him over to the Superior Court. He automatically goes to Superior Court. And the reason is that because the incidence of victimization committed by these 16-year-olds and even 15-year-olds is getting worse and worse all the time. And that's sort of an incremental way of dealing with that particular problem. There's some other things that restitution can be done. I'm not sure that we need all of these long jail sentences, but what we do need, and this whole idea of 3 strikes and you're out is one that mystifies me. I have a good friend of mine, the police chaplain for the New Jersey State Police, Rabbi Ornstein, who gave me an incredible idea about 6 years ago. I thought it was wonderful. I'd never really thought about it before, because I got up involved in this Trinitarian idea of strike 1, strike 2, and strike 3. His suggestion was punish severely the first offender, because in he lies the greatest hope of reform. And I said, hey, you know, that makes a lot of sense. What we do is we increase the sentence for the 15th time offender. That's when we're going to throw the book at you this time. If we had punished him in an appropriate way the first time, there may not be a second and a third time. That's the reason why I don't like the, I know you understand that, Robert. Anyway, that's the reason why I don't like the concept. I know they have it in this state, they're developing it, of the 3 strikes and you're out, because it requires, let's say a rapist, rape victim number 1, rape victim number 2, rape victim number 3, too many victims. What about rape victim number 1, period? What about that? And the way you get that, don't even think about probation or think about parole for those kinds of individuals. You've got to put the heavy penalty up front, and when they straighten out, as they say, they will not depart from it. Thank you very much.